Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about the Russian railways, because historically, the railway system in Russia has been seen as a bellwether as to how good the economy is performing. When the economy is doing well, there is lots of demand for rail transport because Russia is a very large country. It's the largest country in the world in terms of its geographical space. And so, in order to move things backwards and forwards, whether it be people or cargo or raw materials, the railway system is actually the cheapest way of doing that. So, when the economy in Russia is doing well, then the railway system is also booming. When the economy isn't doing so well, then the railway system struggles. And the railway system at the moment is on the verge of potentially collapsing because it's built up an eye-watering $51 billion worth of debt. And this is a state-run entity, so it's a national enterprise. It's owned by the Kremlin, it's owned by the government, so it should be making lots of profit. But unfortunately, it isn't. And the Kremlin is now looking at ways to bail this business out. So let's get into the details as to what this company looks like. Now, just before we go any further today, can I ask everybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please smash that subscriber button? I'm trying to increase my numbers, and I know these messages are slightly annoying for people who have already subscribed, but they do work, so apologies, but please hit that button and let's get back to the video. Russian railway system, which is officially called RZhD, and I won't bother trying to pronounce the Russian equivalent of that, what the actual words are, because I'll get it all wrong, and also it doesn't really matter, does it? But it's the biggest single employer in Russia. It employs 700,000 people. So that is a lot of people who are dependent on this company for their salaries. And as we've talked about many times before, we've got a multiplier effect. When you pay somebody a salary, they will then go and spend in their local economy. That means they are putting money into the tills of local businesses. And so that helps to grow the economy. If people have to be made redundant or see their pay being cut, then that has a negative multiplier effect. It shrinks the local economy. And that's potentially what this business is now looking at. Now, the current crisis is all about the debt that this business has built up. It's currently sitting at 4 trillion rubles, which, as I said earlier, is the equivalent of around $51 billion. Now, that is a lot of money for a state-owned enterprise. Russia historically hasn't been using debt, so this tells us that this business has been losing money because the only reason that you would take on debt is to cover losses. And the reason why it is losing money is that firstly, it's got aging infrastructure. This system was built up during the Soviet Union days and hasn't really been updated that much recently. So it's aging, which means that costs are always increasing. And the breakdown of the debt, we've got 1.8 trillion rubles, so almost half of the debt is short-term debt. And the problem with short-term debt is that you need it to be renewed. So basically, if it's in place for a year, let's say, and the Russian banks who are providing this debt come to have their annual meeting with you and say, okay, let's have a look at what's going on, they can see that the debt is ballooning, so it's up to 51 billion. But also they can see that the company isn't making any profit. So as a lender, you'd be saying, well, I'm not sure that I want to renew this debt. I talked about this recently, but one of the reasons why companies and state entities issue bonds is because it's long-dated debt. Once it's issued, you don't have to worry about it as long as you keep making the coupon payments, the interest payments. But when you've got short-dated debt, like the railway system has, it's a big problem because when you come for your renewal, either you might not get renewed or you might find that your interest cost has gone up materially. And the problem that the Russian railway system is facing is the interest cost because it's now sitting at $7 billion per year. That's how much they're paying in interest. That is incredible. And the reason why they're paying that much interest is because interest rates in Russia have risen materially since the invasion of Ukraine. Before the invasion, they were sitting at around about 8.5%. They were recently up as high as 21%. It's now down to 16.5%. But as a borrower, you're going to have to pay more than just the base rate. So the Russian railways on their short-dated debt, which renews each year, will be paying over 20% interest on all of that borrowing. And that's the reason why this business is now having to restructure its entire facilities. Now, in terms of revenue, the company pulled in $3.3 billion worth of revenue in 2024. So that's quite a lot of revenue. But unfortunately, its costs were $2.8 billion. So that tells us that it's making a $500 million profit. So that's quite good. But it isn't really when you think about the interest cost on its debt. So $500 million of profit against $7 billion of interest cost means that the Russian railways are basically losing $6.5 billion in the last 12 months. And unfortunately, the situation's getting worse because the demand for rail transport is actually reducing as the number of companies in Russia who are using it because they're exporting things like grain, oil products, and the people using it, the demand for that is going down. So the revenue is falling at the same time as the interest cost bill is rising. So the Russian authorities are now in a really difficult situation where they're having to talk about restructuring this debt. Now, in terms of the options available to them, they are multiple. The first option is that the National Wealth Fund could invest money into the railway system in exchange for equity in the company. So basically, the National Wealth Fund would be buying shares in the railway company. Now, I don't think that Russia is going to want to do that because the National Wealth Fund has been used to fund the war in Ukraine. We've seen it falling from around $150 billion equivalent at the start of the war to less than $30 billion today. We don't know exactly how much is in it right now, but it's less than 30. Potentially, it could be less than 10. So realistically, the National Wealth Fund isn't really an option, even though it is something that people are talking about. The second option is that the State Development Bank could also make an investment into the railway system. But for the same reasons, I don't think that the State Development Bank would want to do that because this is basically a bailout. And the last thing that you want to do is use up valuable capital, putting money into a company that is losing $6.5 billion and rising, because if revenue keeps coming down and interest rates keep going up, and interest costs go up, then the gap is going to widen. So the other option that Russia is now looking into is a debt equity swap. So this is a classic mechanism that's used when you're restructuring companies that can't afford to keep paying for their debt. They're basically over leveraged. So the banks who've lent all of this money, this $51 billion, could agree to reduce the amount of debt by taking equity in exchange. So essentially, they would be given shares in the company in exchange for writing off their debt. So we could be talking up to half of that debt, could be $25 billion is written off by the Russian banks. And they will then be given a piece of paper saying, you now own a percentage of the Russian railway system. Now, what that piece of paper is actually worth is questionable because if you're given shares in a company that is making huge losses, then realistically, you're not going to get paid any dividends because it doesn't have any cash. That's the reason why it's doing the debt equity swap, because it can't afford to pay all of its outgoings. And also, how are you going to exit from that investment? Because it's a state-owned entity, so they're unlikely to sell it to anybody else in the future. They wouldn't do that anyway from a security point of view. Russia wouldn't want Chinese owners of its railway system, for example. And it's unlikely that it would be floated on the stock market because who's going to buy the shares in a company that's basically failing? So essentially, what could happen is that the Russian banks will be told to write off all of that debt, be given a piece of paper that is essentially worthless. It won't bring any value in now or anytime in the future. And so essentially what we're looking at is the Russian banks having to swallow all of this debt. So what this means is that their capital and their balance sheets is going to be impacted. Those banks will have to write off a huge amount of debt, which will affect their results and potentially put those banks at risk of failing. I've been looking into this recently. There are a lot of banks in Russia that don't have enough capital to cover all of their non-performing loans. Look out for that video coming out soon. So what we've got is a situation here where the backbone of Russia, the railway system, which is essential for the Russian economy, it moves a huge volume of people and goods every single day. A lot of it for export, so a lot of those goods are moved to the coast And those goods are then shipped all around the world, or they were previously before all of the sanctions were put into place. This railway system is old and decrepit. It needs a lot of investment to update it. Unfortunately, the company is making huge losses as a result of the $51 billion worth of debt that it's built up. And this debt is rising rapidly because interest rates are very high in Russia right now. So the interest bill has ballooned over the last few years, and the Russian railway company can't afford to pay that interest. So it's now asking the banks to basically write off all of the debt. But that doesn't solve the problems in the railway system. It's still old and decrepit and needs updating. And the big question is, where is that money going to come from? So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we've been talking a lot about the impact of the sanctions, and the sanctions are hurting lots of companies in Russia. Now, you may have thought that the Russian railway system would be immune to those sanctions because it only operates in Russia. The demand for Russian railways is only coming from Russian people and Russian businesses. So you would have thought that no impact at all on that business. However, obviously, the users of the Russian railway system, a lot of them are Russian companies because there's a lot of cargo that is having to be moved hundreds and thousands of miles across Russia from the mining areas or wherever things are being produced to the ports so that all of those goods can then be exported. But as we've seen the sanctions increasing over the past few years, we have seen a reduction in the demand for those cargoes, because if you're a Russian exporter and you've lost all of your export markets because nobody will deal with you because of the war in Ukraine, then you don't need to put all of your goods onto railway carriages and send them to the ports. So there's been a drop in demand for Russian railway services. And at the same time, Russian individuals are also moving around less because the economy isn't growing as rapidly as it was before the war started. So there has been a reduction in demand for the railway network at the same time as the network has been getting old and decrepit and needs updating. So there's a demand for capital, but a fall in revenue. But the biggest problem that the railway system is facing is the interest on the debt. So it has built up 4 trillion rubles worth of debt, $51 billion. And because it doesn't have enough money even to pay the interest, that debt is increasing all the time because the interest is just being added to the loans. So it's now got to a very serious situation where the Kremlin is looking at restructuring the whole company because it's owned currently by the state, and the state doesn't want to bail it out because it doesn't have enough money to keep funding all of the infrastructure. And it's not just the railway system that is struggling right now. There are lots of other parts of the economy that are starting to fail, but I'm focusing on the railway system in this video. So the Kremlin doesn't want to keep funding all of these losses. So it's now telling the banks that there's going to have to be some sort of deal agreed. And the most likely outcome is that the banks will have to write off a huge portion of their debt. Could be as much as half of it gets written off or exchanged for equity. But as we discussed earlier in the video, there's a question mark as to whether there's any value in that equity. If you're writing off $25 billion worth of debt, you would want some serious value in terms of the equity that you're being given. But when you're being given shares in a loss-making entity, that doesn't have a great deal of value. But that's what the banks are facing. They're going to have to swallow a lot of that debt, and that's going to put pressure on the balance sheet of those banks. We could see Russian banks actually posting losses this year, which is bizarre when you think that interest rates are up at 16.5%. You would have thought that these were bumper times for the Russian bank. They would actually be making huge profits. But the problem is they've got a lot of companies that can't afford to pay the interest. It's not just the Russian railway systems. There are lots of commercial businesses that now don't have enough cash to be able to make those payments. So on paper, the Russian banks should be making lots of profit. But in reality, they're actually seeing losses rising on a daily basis. So there's a big question here as to whether the Russian banks will be able to survive all of the losses that are coming towards them right now. And the Russian railway system is just one of many different industries that are going to have to renegotiate their facilities with the banks. But the overall summary of today's video is that the Russian railway network has been seen as a bellwether of the Russian economy. When the Russian economy does well, so does the railway company. When the Russian economy is struggling, then so is the railway entity. And that's what's happening right now. We are seeing the Russian economy slowing down. And in today's video, we've talked about the fact that the railway company is now bankrupt. It doesn't have enough money to keep paying its debt. If this was a normal entity in the West, it would be declared bankrupt. It would be liquidated, and then basically you'd pay as much back to the banks as you could and then close everything down. But obviously, this is a state-run enterprise. Russia needs its railway network to continue operating, so it can't allow the company to go bankrupt and close everything. So what it's doing instead is finding an alternative way forward. And the alternative way is getting the banks to write off a lot of their debt. It doesn't solve the problems in the railway network, but it will reduce the debt burden in the short term. But somebody is going to have to swallow the pain on this, and it's the Russian banks. And that raises the risk of seeing failures in the Russian banking system. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much to everyone that's supporting me. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a Patreon or a member or a Buy Me a Coffee member, thank you for that support. Really helps to keep me going. And here's something to put a smile on your face.